Hello, thanks for coming to the Hudson Institute today. We're delighted to host today's event, and I'm delighted to be up here with this distinguished panel who I will introduce momentarily. And to those of you watching on the live stream, thanks for joining and for tuning in as well. I'm Michael Sobolik. I'm a senior fellow here at Hudson, and we're convening a conversation today about campus communism, how the Chinese Communist Party compromised Harvard and U.S. higher education. The impetus for this event and for our gathering is a recent report that Isaac, one of our panelists, Isaac Stonefish, his institution, Strategy Risks, published a report earlier this summer detailing specifics of how the Chinese Communist Party has infiltrated and exploited one of America's most prestigious universities. We're going to get into all of that info in the course of this discussion. I'm going to give a brief background about Isaac, since we're on his subject right now. He's the founder and CEO of Strategy Risks. He's the author of a fantastic book that I would commend to all of you called America Second, which came out last year or 2 years ago, one of those two, fairly recently. He's a leading voice on U.S.-China relations. He's contributed to a number of outlets, among them Barron's. He's a former Beijing correspondent, former editor at Newsweek and Foreign Policy, respectively. He brings deep regional expertise, and he also spent many years reporting inside of China. So it's great to have you on the panel. Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me.
I think something that we'll get into in the course of this conversation, it wasn't just that the CCP infiltrated Harvard. There was a door wide open. In many cases, Harvard knew exactly what they were doing with these partnerships. And to speak to that element, particularly with how it relates to ongoing atrocities inside of China with the Uyghur genocide and how that implicates Harvard, we have another panelist with us today, Elfidar Eltaber, who is a leader in the Uyghur American community, has been for a long time. My wife and I have known her for a while, and it's a real pleasure to have you here today to share your expertise. Elfidar is the president of the Uyghur American Association, a fearless human rights activist known for her advocacy on Uyghur issues. She was born in Urumqi, raised in Istanbul, and she gives over 2 decades of experience in these issues. Before we dive into the conversation, talking about Harvard today is, we have a charged context politically, so I want to say just a few words about the broader context of the political moment before we get into the conversation. Harvard is a bit of a Rorschach test right now. People on the left and the right see completely different things when they look at Harvard. On the left, a premier American institution. On the right, a once great university captured by extreme ideologues. There are, of course, deeper dimensions going on right now, too, with debates about free speech, the limits of executive leadership, anti-Semitism. There's a lot of conversation today about this specific university. But we're here today because Harvard isn't just a cultural flashpoint, it's a national security flashpoint. And there's a story here about how one of our greatest crown jewels in higher ed was willingly co-opted by a foreign adversary. And it's just a microcosm of this broader problem in US academia, where the appetite for money seems to supersede any due diligence or ethical concerns about where that money is coming from. So in many ways, the fact that Harvard is so politicized today is in and of itself a bit of a victory for the Chinese Communist Party. And I think it's important to step back and recognize that. The CCP is out to whittle away at the trust we as Americans have in our own institutions. When Americans view either their ideologue opponents on either side of the spectrum as the true story and the real enemy, valid as those concerns may be, that rebounds to the benefit of an external threat. Because the more we look at each other, the less we can be focused on a common adversary that we as Americans all share. So at the top, I want to at least get the perspective for what we are and what we are not talking about today. This discussion is about identifying truth, what has happened at Harvard with the CCP, what is happening in our broader higher education, and what we can do about it. With that, let's dive in. So Isaac, we talked about how Americans view this institution of higher education, this perceptions of Harvard. When the Chinese Communist Party looks at Harvard, what do they see, and what did you uncover as you pulled this report together?
Thank you. Two caveats before we dive in. First, I have to leave about 10 minutes early. It's not because of your excellent and scary questions. So just saying that on the top. Second is I have a lot of conflicted feelings about what happened after this report came out and what the Trump administration has done with it. We can talk about that in detail. Broadly speaking, US government, whether Republican or Democrat, is much more effective wielding a hammer than a scalpel. It's very difficult to be targeted on these issues, and so we'll get into those in some detail. On how Beijing views Harvard, there's this kind of half joke that, Harvard is the Hongxiao, it's the red school, it's the party school. And there's long been a sense that because Harvard is the best in the world, this is where the party elite need to go. And we saw that with Xi Jinping's daughter. We saw that with Bo Guagua. We've seen that with countless other leaders and their children and their grandchildren, most of whom aren't reported on in the press. It's a very difficult question about how much blame to give Harvard. On the one hand, Harvard produces some of the most excellent critical anti-CCP work of anywhere in the world. There's wonderful scholars there. I'm proud of Harvard for hosting Lobsang Sangay, the Tibetan leader in exile, Dennis Kwok, who's a wonderful Hong Kong dissident, has an affiliation with there. And at the same time, they've made some pretty major ethical compromises and compliance lapses. And I'm glad that we're having a conversation able to hold them to account.
Elfidar, let me pose the same question to you, but from a different vantage point. When Uyghurs look at an institution like Hong Kong, Uyghurs specifically, maybe the Uyghur activist community in the United States, some of the details that we're going to get into in the course of this conversation suggest that Harvard either was incredibly ignorant and reckless with their partnerships with authorities in China, or they were knowingly complicit in empowering agents in Xinjiang that are engaged in the ongoing genocide of Uyghurs with technical training. So when you look at this institution, what do you see?
First of all, thank you so much for having me here, and thank you for the Hudson Institution. We were disappointed to hear this report in details. However, we were kind of familiar with what's going on in the top universities in the US. As you know, the Confucius Institution, we were trying to do the similar thing in the past, and it's more aware, like public awareness is a little more well known. For the top universities, I just want to start with the example. Last year in April 2024, when the Taiwanese student, I believe her name is Corsette Wu, interrupt the speech of Chinese ambassador Xi Feng during the business meeting, and she was dragged out of the meeting by the exchange Chinese students, not the faculty staff or the security staff, by the Chinese students. They had the rights to do that. I was like shocked, the level of comfort of the Chinese students in those top universities. So what we see from Uyghurs' perspective is Chinese government is using their every way they can to access and then use for their, basically for their intention to be number one superpower in the world, economically, politically, and they've been sending students, government officials to be trained to those top schools. So we are definitely looking more deeper into it. We would like the U.S. government, those schools to hold those officials accountable and not allow those Chinese government officials, especially CCP officials, to get better at the oppression of Uyghurs and oppression of other nations.
And I'm glad you brought up that specific example with the student at Harvard. For those of you who don't know this background, the Select Committee on Competition with the Chinese Communist Party in the House, House of Representatives, a few months ago, did an investigation into this issue where during the speech from this Chinese diplomat, there was, I think you said, a Taiwanese student who was protesting, literally assaulted by a PRC national, drug out. And then the follow-up to this, which was even more crazy than the initial incident, Harvard apologized to the Chinese student that assaulted the Taiwanese student, but did not say anything that I know of, at least, and correct me if I'm wrong, nothing that I know of in regards to the Taiwanese student who was assaulted. And it goes to this broader issue that both of you are talking about. Let's zoom out, though, because we need the bird's eye perspective to properly, I think, interpret some of these findings in your report, Isaac. Because even though your report is about Harvard, this broader problem is so much bigger than just Harvard. There's an institutional-wide problem with Chinese CCP money in higher education. And Elfadar, you alluded to this as well in your response just now. Isaac, can you give us a lay of the land for how the Chinese Communist Party has infiltrated and leveraged money to wield influence in higher education here?
Until about 2014 to 2016, it was US government policy and widely accepted that it was in the best interest of the United States to strengthen the Chinese Communist Party. All of these prominent universities did capacity building programs. You'd bring Chinese judges, you'd bring Chinese police officials over, and you'd try to train them to be better Communist Party judges and better police officials. And as crazy as this idea seems today, that was policy, that was norm. And with that, there was a very wide acceptance of Chinese money and little questions asked about the provenance and about the political ties between those entities and the Communist Party. What we've seen over the last roughly 8 years is a reckoning, is a hangover of all of this. And we've seen slow, and now it's really starting to accelerate, but slow for the last several years, pushback on some of these things and some of the major ethical and legal compromises that have come from accepting widespread Chinese influence and Chinese money. The Chinese students piece of this is, I would say, the most ethically fraught and most complicated piece of it, because there are no good answers for it. And we don't have a good agreed on framework about how to deal with Chinese espionage, or even frankly, what is Chinese espionage in universities. So I'll give an example. Yeah, there's a classroom, hypothetical classroom at Harvard, two Chinese students in the classroom. One Chinese student says something about democracy that's very pro. The second Chinese student sends a message to his dad, who's a party official, and says, hey, like my friend Xiao Wang said this really interesting thing about Chinese democracy. What do you think? Is that student a spy? So there's no good answer to that, because on the one hand, he's just talking to his dad about some interesting thing that happened in class. On the other hand, he's reporting on a Chinese student to a party official, something that could get him in deep trouble in China. So many edge cases like that. At the same time, there are so many very egregious examples that do not get targeted or do not get the attention that they deserve. Where we are going with all of this, and I think the other broad framework is, I firmly believe that the US and China are headed to war. And I believe that what Secretary Rubio did with his ban or restriction on Chinese students, depending on how you see it, is try to jolt the country into having a conversation about where are we, what does this look like, and how do we handle it. And there's so many important questions on this. Perhaps the most important of them are the ethical questions. How do we address this? How do we tackle it? And so I'm appreciative of Michael and Hudson for tackling these issues and platforming this conversation. There's a lot to unpack.
Speaking of which, let's start unpacking. So you mentioned in your report, Isaac, a number of different ways that Harvard, not just on those edge cases, as you mentioned, but in the core really egregious cases, opened the doors wide for this malign influence. You say, quote, the Communist Party of China influences Harvard University through financial leverage, partnerships, and collaborations with Harvard organizations, and they exploit the influence they attain through those vectors to promote Beijing's policy agenda, censorship, and geostrategic objectives. You also mentioned, and I think this is important for context here, from 2013 to 2020, over the course of those 7 years or so, Harvard received roughly $94 million from various Chinese sources, which is the most money from Beijing of any American university. So let's talk about how that money was leveraged and to what effect. You talk about propaganda in this report, and we're going to start with a few examples, then build up to the Uyghur genocide in just a few minutes here. But with propaganda, you talk about how the Harvard T-Chan School for Health had this interesting report that mentioned something that is super arcane that a lot of Americans have actually probably never heard of before, called barefoot doctors. That means nothing to most Americans. To the Chinese Communist Party, that means something very specific. What was going on in that case?
So barefoot doctors was a health idea that the party put out, I believe for the first time in the late 50s, and it was, we have a horrific health system, so we're going to have peasants go and act as doctors. Perhaps at the time, it was better than having no doctors at all. However, especially during the Cultural Revolution, the anarchic period from 66 to 76, doctors were, the small number of doctors that were in China, many of them were struggled against, many of them were murdered for the crime of being educated, being away from the peasants and away from the agricultural paradise that Mao thought he was building. And so instead of using actual health professionals, you'd have 22-year-old Chinese peasants with no training on health issues whatsoever being sent to act as doctors. And it was very bizarre to me to see the Chan School advocate for this as an idea and to pretend that the idea was divorced from any sort of political context. And I think what we have to remember with the injection of Chinese Communist Party phrases into American discourse is that words do not mean what we want them to mean or what we think they mean. Words are under this broader political context. And so the example I like to cite is if I was having a conversation with you all 20 years ago and we're talking about humanism and someone says, there's a lot of focus on human rights, and I say, yes, all lives matter. 20 years ago, that's a not controversial statement. I'm not making any sort of point at all. I'm just expressing humanism. Today, if I say that I'm going against Black Lives Matter, I'm making a very specific political statement. And so one has to understand that. And a lot of times what happens with universities, Harvard is a bad example of this, but this is quite common, is people will repeat phrases and not know what they mean. So they'll say things like, China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. Well, yes, from a certain period to a certain period, there's a lot less poverty in China. That phrase implies that the Communist Party lifted those people out of poverty, as opposed to the Communist Party put those people in poverty, and then Chinese people working against the party lifted themselves out. China has 5,000 years of history is another phrase. It implies that the party is the apogee of Chinese history, and that we should all just blithely understand their view of history. Another example to drive the point home, let's say I'm a socialist, and I think we should be socialists on the national level. I would be foolhardy to say I'm a national socialist, because that is what Nazi means. Nazi is National Socialist. And so understand that when people are using phrases borrowed from China and the Chinese Communist Party, they mean specific things to the party, and they're dangerous phrases for us to repeat unknowingly. Final one I'll cite there is friend. Friend seems like such a bland term. Why is it wrong to be a friend of Vietnam or a friend of Japan or a friend of China's? The answer is because when the party uses the phrase friend, what they mean is a lackey of the Communist Party. They mean someone who advocates for the party, who implements United Front principles of strengthening the party's friends and weakening their enemies. And so when you hear Bill Gates being called by Xi Jinping the best friend of China, not a compliment.
And Elfeder, just a quick follow-up to you on this. We see this exact same phenomenon in how the party targets Uyghurs as well, with the way they try to isolate Uyghurs as separatists, terrorists. And that word terrorist, to Isaac's point, means something to us in America, but to the CCP, it means something very differently. So if you could just say a few words about how this root idea of nomenclature, how Uyghurs are experiencing the CCP's weaponization of words.
Sure. As you know, the Uyghurs were living independently until 1949, and that's when we were occupied by the Chinese government, Chinese Communist Party, and then since then, slowly, we were friends, right?
Yep.
As you mentioned. They wanted to help develop train stations, buildings, and we welcomed them. And the population back then was 95% Uyghurs and 5% Han Chinese. But as you notice today, it is almost 60-70% Han Chinese in our land. Slowly, our properties were taken, confiscated, livelihood of Uyghurs were destroyed, and anything slightly against criticism of government was considered terrorist, separatist.
Yep.
And it accelerated recent years with Xi Jinping's term. And now the words that government use to describe Uyghurs as viruses, as you know, that is increasing and they need to control. That's how they describe it. And the words Xi Jinping himself used, as you know, is destroy their origins, like, you know, that frame, I can't remember it at the moment, but absolutely no mercy. That is the political message that Xi Jinping is giving to its own people, its own military, its own police. And that's his policy to eradicate Uyghurs fully from our homeland, East Turkestan. And they've been continuing this Uyghur genocide in order to achieve their goal. However, with the Western governments' help and support, now 11 to 12 countries and governments and parliaments declared it as genocide. It kind of slowed down their intention, but I don't think it has changed. They just changed their strategy. Now whitewashing with tourism, and they're saying that no more camps are closed, no more genocide going on, and come visit China, and they're continuing their propaganda with these kind of words now.
That's right. And I think this is one of the ironies in this whole conversation that we're having. Like, universities are known, if for nothing else, than their insistence on precision with the English language and with the meaning of words. And I think Isaac and Elfadar, the point that both of you are making is Harvard, and not just Harvard alone, but we're talking about Harvard today, has maybe in ways they should have known better, or maybe they did know, we can't speak to intent, but they have allowed the agenda of a foreign adversary to get laundered through the programming of their university. So when we talk about something as arcane as barefoot doctors, which again, most Americans have no idea what that means something to them because it whitewashes a part of their history that is brazenly barbaric, and they want it erased and told on their terms. And we have American institutions doing this for them, which is a huge problem. One more secondary example, then we'll dive into the genocide stuff. There was this survey that you talk about, Isaac, in this report called Understanding CCP Resilience. This was something that, again, another body within Harvard conducted after taking money from a Chinese entity. The survey covered public opinion in China from 2003 to 2016. And this was the finding of this Harvard report. Quote, Chinese citizens' satisfaction with government has increased virtually across the board, unquote. Which I guess there are a couple of things to unpack there. Number one, the exchange of money versus the finding. That's interesting. But the really interesting thing here is how you even measure something like public opinion inside of a country like China, where free speech does not exist. And if you do speak, it is very clear to everyone where the incentive structure pushes you to the kind of answers you need to give for your own personal safety and for your own well-being. So, Isaac, let me throw this back to you again. What does this do to the perception of trustworthiness of institutions like Harvard, where, at least from the appearance, whether right or wrong, it appears that this kind of analysis is bought and paid for by a foreign adversary.
There's a reason why top universities should, and in most cases do, this is a glaring exception, have very strict rules regulating who's paying for academic research and who's paying for surveys. Because with this particular survey, problems are multifold. One is, yes, it's very difficult to conduct public opinion polling in China. It is possible, let's take a hypothetical, it's possible that from 2003 to 2016, that actually happened. The survey is 100% accurate. We don't believe it because we see who funded the survey and we think, oh, of course they're going to want to push this forward. So we don't trust the research. Again, it's very possible that the research is 100% accurate, but we doubt it because of who's funding it. You know, if I'm going up here and I'm saying, hi, my name is Isaac Stonefish and I am a vector of the US government and here are my views. You're going to think, huh, okay. Maybe my views are exactly the same if I weren't taking money from XYZ entity. But with that, and I should disclaim that I run a business, we work with corporations, people fund what we do. My views are not entirely my own. There's this very disingenuous thing, I'll rant for a second here. There's a very disingenuous thing that government officials or people in institutions will say. They'll say, oh, my views are my own and they don't necessarily reflect the State Department or this or that. No, you don't. That's a lie. Your views are not your own. You would not say those things if you had a different job. You would say them differently. You're still constrained by that. And so let's not pretend that we are acting in some sort of pure ideological context. We're heavily influenced by the money we take and the networks that we're in. And that goes very explicitly for me as well. Back to the survey. Because there's an intentionality with it, we don't trust the research. We don't trust where it comes. It's actually quite similar to Hollywood movies and the question of China. For the last decade or so, Hollywood movies have not portrayed Chinese people as anything but angels. It's very intellectually offensive when you watch it because Chinese people are humans. They do bad things. If you'll forgive my language, some of them are assholes. I'm always very suspicious when people say, oh, I went to China, everyone there was wonderful. It's like, have you been to anywhere where everyone, you go to any part of, I went to DC, everyone there was wonderful. That's probably not true. People are nuanced. They have different views. You might like them, you might not. So Hollywood movies portray a single type of Chinese person. And when you see that and you think about it, you don't trust the portrayal. So there are, you watch a movie and you say, oh, this Chinese person is wonderful and saved the world. That is a reasonable thing to do once or twice, but when you do it across the spectrum, it is a deep reflection of censorship. And so in my book, I talked about this and I compared it to Nazi cinema. I don't recommend watching this movie. It wasn't very good and got a couple political problems, but there's a movie called Big Love, which was made in the Nazi era. And it was the only Nazi film that I've ever seen, besides Triumph of the Will, that you have to basically watch in Hebrew school. But that aside, you watch this movie and it all, just from that context, it all seems to make sense. Because you say, okay, maybe this is the way that people behaved. But then if you step back and look at the broader political context, you realize, oh, the filmmaker didn't have many choices in making this movie. He had to portray these people in a couple of archetypes. And so it's similar to what reports like that are funded are. You think, okay, well, there's only a couple of options that they have, and so they put this out, and we cannot trust them for the background. It's a sad thing, but that's the reality with that report and reports like it.
And we're knocking on the door of not just foreign money in academia, but foreign money in Washington with all those conversations. So if we have time to get into legislation that might need revamping in the Q&A or later, maybe we can do that. But for now, let's turn our attention to what I think is the most interesting part of your report. How Harvard trained officials in Xinjiang that were complicit in the genocide and got training that potentially was relevant to the activities they were doing. Elfidar, let me turn to you real quick. The entity that Isaac singles out in his report is, again, something that 99.9% of Americans have never heard of before. The abbreviation is the XPCC, the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corporation, if I remember correctly. Talk to us about the XPCC, because it's not just another acronym organization in the milieu of government. This is a central entity in Xinjiang that is quite unique. Could you tell us a little bit about its background and what it does?
Sure. So Xinjiang paramilitary construction corps, we also call Bingtuan, in Chinese and Uyghurs knows as Bingtuan. That was established 1950s, 1954s, I believe. The main goal was to settle Han Chinese into our region and control the borders. However, they have a superpower. It's just like state inside a state. They have, at that time, 2.5 million, I believe. We call them just like the police, Chinese party officials. They came to our land, and then they control the economy. They control all the agriculture farmlands. They control all the religious activities, for example. They control the borders. The main job is to settle more Han Chinese into our land. And recently, the Bingtuan, the XPCC, is directly implementing China's genocidal policies. They're the ones who are handling it. So if you look at it, while Chinese XPCC officials bringing more Han Chinese into our region, to dilute our population, to make us minority, they're also responsible of transferring Uyghurs, young Uyghurs, to inner China, to factories and other facilities under the name of we're finding you a job, but they're also taking Uyghurs out to dilute further. And while they're taking those Uyghurs out there, that is part of the forced labor practices, they're also separating the families. Parents are long months and months in those factories in China. The children are sent to state-run orphanages, boarding schools, and being stripped away from their language, their identity, their religion, their tradition, culture, and basically raised as a loyal CCP, future Han Chinese, that they look like Uyghurs, but they speak Chinese, they think like Chinese. So Bingtuan, which is XPCC, is also implementing the forced labor, and they have control of the farmlands. And if I remember correctly, when I was in China, we were complaining about the XPCC because they hold the source of the water coming to the farmlands. Therefore, farmers don't have waters, they can't get any products out, and they had to force to sell their land to Bingtuan. And then they work for XPCC as workers just to fill their stomach. And that's how they handled and confiscated all those lands and then make our people to work as a forced labor or slave labor. This was like 1990s and 1995s. And now the full genocidal policies is being implemented by Bingtuan.
And some of those genocidal policies specifically, and Isaac, you mentioned this in the report, compulsory sterilization, involuntary organ donations, medical experimentation, super, super dark stuff. How does this connect to Harvard?
So Harvard several times invited members of the XPCC to trainings that it was conducting in China. I'm not a sanctions lawyer. I can't conclusively say whether or not it's a sanctions violation. Senator Tom Cotton thought it might be enough that he sent a letter to Secretary Bessent to investigate whether or not it is actually a sanctions violation.
Weren't they supposed to get back by June 2nd?
Hopefully, we'll see. We'll see what comes up of it. Okay. The issue here is partnering and working with sanctioned entities, and the issue is one both of judgment and compliance. And when I've had conversations with folks in the Harvard administration in the past, they talk about it being a very diversified model and them not having governance over various arms of the university. In some ways, that can be a strength at times like this. And again, is this something that they're just saying to blow me off? Is this actually an integral part of the university? I'm not sure. But it allowed for the Chan School to make these horrifically large lapses of judgment. Because you think about it and you think the gain from something like that is so small. And I've had some people after the report tell me, well, why did it matter that they were training them on matters of insurance? And it's kind of a funny question. And you think, well, it would have been worse had they been training them in organ harvesting. Like, certainly there's a lot of other things they could have done that would have been far more egregious. But engaging with this entity is probably a violation of US law. It's certainly a major regulatory risk. And what did you think would happen? And I think it kind of comes down to this point of just how slow entities are to change, even when they're being forced to change by reality. You know, how long it took people to adjust to COVID restrictions, how long it's taken people to adjust. I do not think we are adjusted to the idea of the Communist Party as an enemy. I do not think it's there. I do not think most Americans understand that. And I think the wake-up is getting ruder and ruder.
I think that is one of the most crucial observations when it comes to US-China right now. We talk a lot about competition. We talk a lot about decoupling, de-risking. A whole lot of buzzwords define how we talk about our relationship with the People's Republic of China. But Isaac, I think you're right. Most Americans distrust China. A lot of Americans don't like the Chinese government because of COVID and because of trade and discrete issues. High levels of distrust if you look at polling. But if you ask about a perception of not just this foreign country, but the specific entity of the CCP, at least in Washington elite, I think you're absolutely right. There isn't this ingrained bipartisan consensus that that number one, they're an enemy, and number two, it's a Cold War. I think on both those counts, that's right. Elfidar, Isaac mentioned sanctions. So let's piggyback on that because you've already talked about the genocide determination from 2021. The prior year, though, was when the first Trump administration singled out the XPCC for sanctions. Could you tell us a little bit about the authorities and the type of sanctions that were put on these guys before this Harvard training took place?
Sure. As Bing Tuan linked to Uyghur forced labor and Uyghur genocide, in 2020, U.S. government sanctioned XPCC for its implementation of genocidal policies. And also, Treasury Department sanctioned 2 to 3 Chinese government officials that are in Bing Tuan and who implemented those genocidal policies. They were sanctioned under global Magnitsky sanction. Yep. And that's it, 2 or 3. Since then, we didn't have anyone that are sanctioned. And also, as you know, in 2021, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act passed. With that law, the rebuttable presumption that assumes anything made in our region and linked to Bing Tuan, because Bing Tuan is already sanctioned and enough evidence of forced labor products linked to Bing Tuan partnership corporations and factories and companies are also prohibited to enter the U.S. unless they have clear evidence that is clean. Therefore, multiple steps were taken. The CBP also had withholding for the companies that are linked to Bing Tuan, linked to XPCC. So U.S. government tried its best to sanction those products, especially cotton and tomato, and also textile. And but as you know, today there's seafood, there is automotive sector, and many other industrial sectors are linked to Uyghur forced labor. They're all sanctioned by the U.S. government.
That's right. That's right. And you mentioned global Magnitsky, which is key here. And to nerd out for a second, to underscore the penalties, both civil and criminal, that people risk by violating a global Magnitsky sanction, it ties into pre-existing IEEPA sanctions. And if you pull up 50 U.S. Code 1705, what are those penalties? If it's a civil case, you're looking at something like $250,000 fine. If it's a criminal, you're looking at around $1 million fine and being eligible for not more than 20 years in prison. These are significant sanctions penalties that Harvard risked violating. And I think this picture that I hear from both of you, Elfidar, the gruesome nature of what the CCP is doing inside of China, which I think a lot of us have at least hopefully some level of familiarity with. And if you don't, I'm glad that we're having this conversation today. And for Isaac, what you said a moment ago, how slow and resistant institutions are to change, particularly when something like money, something as fundamental as money is on the line. So before we open it up to a broader conversation, I want to ask a really simple question to both of you. If this is where we are, where our premier, again, just to underscore something that Isaac said before we dive in, if you Google Harvard, you will see instances of them talking about these issues of China human rights on campus. It's not that every single person at this institution is bad. Mm-hmm. It's that there's a severe lack of judgment. And because of that, I think complicity from some of the leadership at Harvard here. So Isaac, Elfidar, how do we change this situation? If there's resistance to change in institutions, and if the CCP's atrocities are not being curtailed at all, and if there's a nexus at the highest levels of US institution to those two problems, how do we go about changing the status quo? What does fixing this look like?
Public conversation, responsible engagement, and naming and shaming.
Talk about naming and shaming. And I'm going to push you on that a little bit.
Great.
Because I find that whether it's a press release or a tweet storm or a signal thread where people of one mind go out to wreck shop on from a PR campaign, that's effective. But I also have seen so many organizations weather that storm, bake it into their operating costs, and then come out a few weeks later and they're fine.
My message to universities and companies, I'll cite the example of RTX, the parent company of Raytheon, which last year was in our top 10 for China exposure, which is horrifying for a defense prime that's supposed to be defending the US homeland against China while importing heavily from China. It doesn't take a PhD in quantum physics to realize the problems there. Institutions and companies need to change. And I'll go back to the point that I started on in the beginning, which is the US government is far more effective with a hammer and a scalpel. And so police yourselves, or the government's going to come in and they're going to make it a lot harder for you.
Elfidar, would love to hear your thoughts to that question too.
Similar, have more raise awareness events to talk about these issues, look into details, have conversations, and hold accountable of those who are responsible. We know Chinese government is well known with their bribery techniques and their debt trap with other countries. So we need to think twice before we take any money from Chinese government officials or anyone from China, and check the sources. Also, we should hold accountable the professors and the doctors at the Harvard University and other universities. They should also do their own due diligence. What else? And I think lawmakers also keep pushing those universities to be transparent and show where they're getting their donations, monies, and where they're spending.
Yeah.
I'll make one more quick point for you, open up for questions.
Sure.
反党与反华不是一回事. Like being against the Communist Party and being against the people of China is a very different thing. Mm-hmm. And far and away, the most anti-Communist Party people I know are all Chinese, period, end.
With that, we have about 15 minutes left before we wrap. Let's open it up to questions. And we'll have a microphone running. Yes, up here in the front. And if you could, just say your name and your affiliation.
Ken Moriyasu from Nikkei Asia. Hi. So yesterday, the FBI arrested 2 Chinese nationals at the University of Michigan for smuggling in dangerous biological pathogens, fungus. And Kash Patel, the FBI director, called it an agent of agroterrorism, this pathogen. In a wider context, does there have to be more scrutiny of Chinese scholars on US campuses? Last night on Fox, there was a discussion about reviving the China Initiative, the notorious China Initiative, that the Department of Justice had in the first Trump administration that went after Chinese scholars? Thank you.
It's a great question. It comes back to the other point. I want universities to police themselves. I want universities to expel the PLA colonels who are there as visiting fellows without telling anyone. I want the Chinese students who are harassing and being awful to other Chinese students, to be disciplined or expelled. And what's happening now, and it's happening in a far more aggressive way than I support, for the record. What's happening now is universities have not been doing that. It's very similar to anti-Semitism. Universities have not been protecting Jewish students. They've not been pushing hard enough against anti-Semitism. So the US government is coming in and it's being far more aggressive than many people would like. But that's how the government operates. That's the fact of the matter. And so I think with this, it's not too late. I really, really hope that US universities can solve these problems themselves, stay out of the Trump administration's spotlight, stay under the radar, and create and foster a better environment for their students and faculty. Up here.
Afternoon, my name is Stephen Bezo and I'm with the Pentagon. Isaac, you made a very good point about 3 minutes ago regarding the difference between when you look at China as a government, as a state government, vice Chinese people. And I've been thinking about this for quite a bit. Recently, the Secretary of Defense, as well as the administration, always refers to China as quote unquote communist China, which can have, of course, several different implications, which could basically mean that everybody in China belongs to the Communist Party and is a communist. Do you agree that the United States government and academia should be referring to China as communist China, or do you think that there's another way that we could kind of refer to them in order to make the distinction between those who are members of the Communist Party and those who are anti-communist? Thank you.
I think it's a great question, and naming here is so important. I think it's Communist Party controlled China, and the party is very explicit that it still adheres to its party roots. If they want to move away from Mao, they can take Mao's face off all of the notes between 1 and 100, and they can take him down from Tiananmen Square. He is still a massive icon, and they have not disclaimed him. I think the naming piece that I find the most infuriating is the South China Sea. It's the South Sea. It's not, the Chinese call it Nanhai. They call it the South Sea. East China Sea, they call it Donghai, the East Sea. So we're giving China a sea that it doesn't claim itself. I find that maddening. I think every use of President Xi also I find deeply problematic. They don't call him President Xi in Chinese. There's a word in Chinese for president that they do not use for him. He's chairman or he's general secretary of the Communist Party. Those are the two titles for him. And so sometimes Chinese media outlets in English, will say, oh, President Xi met with XYZ, and then US news outlets or the US government will uncritically repeat that. I don't have directly on your first point, I think the Communist Party controlled China, but it's a very long phrase. And so I don't have a good short one, but it's a great point, something to think about.
Other questions? Yes, over here.
Hi, Tom Duesterberg from the Hudson Institute. Thanks for your work on this. Can we just think out loud a little bit about universities, and Harvard is the case here, they're businesses. Mike cited some numbers about how much we know directly Harvard has gotten from China, but I wonder if those numbers are not a measure 10 times more than that if we would look carefully, because Harvard has not been good about revealing, reporting the way they're supposed to, everything they get. But the other economic factor is students. So I wonder if you have any thoughts about how we can put pressure on universities based on their economic model. You mentioned, Isaac, earlier, the difficulty of thinking through refusing to have students or including graduate students. But is there a way to leverage the economic dependence that would be material for a place like Harvard?
Tax them, to go in a second, you tax them for IP leakage. So one huge problem with universities, especially ones that take a lot of federal funding, is that they do joint projects with some brilliant, sometimes wonderful, sometimes awful Chinese scholars, depending on the person, and then some of that information, well, basically all of that information almost by definition goes into the party hands because every university in China is overseen by the party most directly. Some are worse than others, but Harvard had all sorts of joint research projects with entities under party control, and some of that research was very sensitive from a national security perspective. And so we see a lot about the externalities of IP theft, and if the universities are the leaks, make them pay for it. It's a way of doing it without directly penalizing Chinese students. Is just saying, listen, if this information is getting in the hands of the Communist Party or a restricted entity, you either have to either there's a fine for it or there's a direct payment. I very much agree with the broader point about the economic cost. It's much broader than that. This was direct money into Harvard. It's Chinese students. It's Harvard's corporate partnerships and continuing education programs. Those are probably billions, if not tens of billions of dollars. And so one wonders what will happen to Harvard's partnerships or universities' partnerships with Microsoft and Apple if a university is very divorced from China, or if a university is seen as anti-CCP. Will big US corporations with heavy China exposure stop working with these universities? That's another potentially huge financial cost.
I'll add just one quick thought, because this is a great point. I think you're talking, about Section 117 of the Higher Education Act, which requires universities to disclose foreign gifts above a certain threshold. The current threshold, when it was passed into law, and I believe is unchanged, is $250,000, any gift at or above that. When I was working in the Senate about a decade ago, this was one of the first things that Congress collectively freaked out about with China policy, was Confucius Institutes and influence in higher education. And when Secretary Rubio was then Senator Rubio, his office, I worked for Ted Cruz, there are a number of different offices keying in on this exact provision, lowering that threshold and increasing the type of disclosure that any university would have to give to the Department of Education. What has changed from 2017, 2018 to now? This much about the Higher Education Act has changed. What has changed is some administrations have done investigations. There was a great effort in the first Trump term. A report came out at the tail end and exposing lack of basic compliance from these universities. But the statute has not changed at all. So you're absolutely right. The numbers that Ed gets is almost always underreported because no one has enforced this law as they should. And the type of details they're required to give are minuscule. So like Section 117 has to get updated. It's long overdue. And for those of you who came late, Isaac will need to leave early. He's not being rude. He has another speaking engagement to get to. He announced that on the top, but for those of you who came later, he will have to depart shortly. Other questions? Yeah, right here in the aisle.
Thank you. Chinese Student Scholar Association.
Oh, sorry, could you give your name and affiliation?
Michael Lucci, State Armor.
Thanks.
The CSSA's, Chinese Student Scholar Association, should these exist? I have the State Department site up now. Says the Communist Party created these to monitor and mobilize their students, talks about intellectual property theft, talks about being like Confucius Institutes. Should these exist? Why do they exist? What are your thoughts on that?
I go back and forth on what degree of free speech absolutism I want and whether or not universities should have the right to have entities that I feel are national security threats and problematic. I think I'd probably come down more on the side that they should exist and they should be known for what they are and they should be more heavily monitored and there should be rules and regulations that they are forced to follow. I think often what happens with organizations like these is that people don't know what they are, they're afraid of them, they don't want to wade into the ethnic morass, and so they let them get away with things they should not get away with, and often that means Chinese students harassing other Chinese students or spying on other Chinese students. But I would say at this point, until we are in a war that I hope will never happen, but I think is coming, that they should be allowed to exist. On that very somber note, I will have to leave. Thank you so much. Really
Isaac, thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you. Other questions? Let me, with the remaining time we have left, Elfadar, I want to ask you about a conversation we were having a few minutes ago. We talk about naming and shaming a lot, and this is something that the Uyghur community has been at the forefront of because, quite unfortunately, American industry from Nike and I suppose Canadian companies like Lululemon, Adidas, Marriott has gotten tied up in this with a Tibet issue. American corporations and American universities are either unwilling or ill-prepared to handle these issues of CCP coercion the right way the first time. And I'd be curious to ask you, when it comes to naming and shaming, how does that interact with something else you said a few minutes ago, which is Congress also has a role to play here? Because if all these things are, whether you're a university or you're Nike, you're a business. And businesses respond to incentives. Are there new incentives that Congress, either through new legislation or the administration through better enforcement, what specific incentives do we not have right now that need to be put in place?
I wish I knew the exact answer to that so we can follow that. As a number, I'm looking at from Uyghurs' perspective.
Yeah.
We are not a lot in the U.S., 10 to 15,000 the most. And as you know, because of the transnational repression, most Uyghurs
Could you actually just take a second for those of you who don't know that phrase? What is transnational repression?
So basically, Uyghurs living in diasporas, let's talk about the Uyghurs in the U.S., are not free even though we are on U.S. soil. Because Chinese government holds our loved ones, our family members hostage and controls our activities here. So we cannot speak out about the truth. We cannot share, my mom is in the camp, we cannot share my siblings are in the camp or killed, because when we do that, we get punished. We get punished even here, with surveillance and spies, and we get punished. Our family, loved ones end up paying the price. That's why we are silenced by this long arm of Chinese governments in the diaspora. So due to transnational repression, even the Uyghurs in the US cannot speak out about those atrocities and what's going on, basically cannot share the truth. They're afraid their loved ones will be killed, because of that, we are very few in numbers as an activist Uyghurs to make noise. That's when we need help from others, the coalition groups, and And what we realized, we cannot make a big impact on companies like Nike's or Apple's and others, but we are on the right side of the history. We have the truth, and we share the truth. And by now, enough evidence and proofs by the journalists, the camp survivors, and others that there's a genocide we're dealing with. And we have to stop as a human being. It's our responsibility to stop this genocide, stop these forced labor practices. So what we can do is build the coalition and contact Congress members. Yeah. And that's how we were trying to make an impact and pass 2 bills in the past to talk to our Congress members, lawmakers, to share the truth in confidential atmosphere most of the time. And also, urge them to take an action. So that's what we've been doing. What else we can do? I think if we can have more, I still believe most people still don't know what's going on in China, the severity of the Uyghur genocide. And the students in universities, they still don't know because of some of the restrictions, because of the policies. If we can raise awareness among the students and share the truth and make them aware of what's happening, I think they will join this fight against freedom. And if we can do that, then we can influence others. That might be one way of, inspiring and encouraging Americans or others to be a responsible consumer, for example, and contact the clothing companies or textile companies and say, if this is forced labor linked, I do not want to purchase it,
Yes.
to use the consumer power, basically. And that can work. For naming and shaming, we try our best with protests and demonstration here and there. However, we need bigger coalitions to hold those companies accountable for what they're doing. They just need to follow the ethics and due diligence they're supposed to. However, the implementation of Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is still not perfect. It has gaps and loops, and
Yes.
sanctions are not truly working, and it's not enough. We need to have more sanction under Magnitsky Act, and we need to make sure the companies who are linked to Uyghur forced labor, linked to Uyghur genocide, pay the price. Like UHRP had a report on the red dates. Even after the XPCC sanction, years after, we find red dates on the shelves of the Asian stores on the U.S. soil.
And this Al-Fadar, I think this is maybe a somber note to end on, but I think it's the correct one, because we're talking about the genocide determination was in 2021. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, one of maybe the most consequential human rights legislation in recent memory after the Global Magnitsky Act, that was in December 2021. You're right that there are enforcement issues with it, lack of enforcement issues, insufficient resources, and political priorities that have complicated that enforcement. We are here talking about the exact same problems that we've been talking about for years, whether it's higher education and foreign influence in higher education, or with enforcement of human rights laws that are tied to an ongoing genocide in America's greatest adversary. This is the note. I think Washington does a lot of talking on China policy. There's a lot of great speeches. There are a lot of great laws that have been passed. What's missing is a political commonality that this is a Cold War that we did not ask for, but we are in. And when you are in a Cold War, you have a binary choice of winning or losing. And this is something that Xi Jinping has made abundantly clear. If you want to learn more about this, I would commend something called Document Number 9 to anyone who's interested in learning how the Chinese Communist Party interprets the United States and the West writ large. But we lack that same level of clarity and precision with how we're dealing with the Chinese Communist Party. And this is how something like Harvard happens, I think, where there's no due diligence, very little thought of compliance, with serious sanctions that are on the books because they know where their money comes from. And if we do not address these problems today, they will continue to metastasize. And as Isaac, I think, ominously said, if we are indeed marching towards war, God forbid, with China, we're going to wish we had done something differently later on. So for that, thank you so much for being part of this conversation, Al-Fadar. Thank you for your advocacy on behalf of Uyghurs. Thank you for what you're doing to educate Americans on what is happening inside of China. Thank you to each of you for coming on the live stream. Thank you for tuning in. Hudson, thank you for hosting, and we will see you next time. Lunch is outside.